When we talk about the vinyl records, most people imagine something like this: big 12-inch LP albums, and we've definitely seen them everywhere, at our grandparents' parents' house, and moreover, they're becoming trendy again. A lot of people are collecting them like back in the days. But in this video I'm going to talk about something a little different, about these strange looking small vinyl records. Well, first of all, why this size, 7-inch? And the main question is, why do they have this huge hole in the middle, and it actually requires this adapter to listen to them? Moreover, I will try to prove it to you that if it weren't for these 7-inch vinyl records, such genres like hip-hop, breakbeat, drum and bass, they wouldn't probably exist nowadays, or they would sound completely different. And there is another question: why in the late 80s and early 90s, almost all American beatmakers and producers went on a hunt to look for samples specifically on those 7-inch records? Let's talk about it today.
The record is finished. After inspection, it'll be ready for shipment to a retailer.
Most definitely, you already know how our favorite music was made and is still made nowadays. At the core of it all are samples. Producers usually take some old tracks from funk, jazz, soul, disco, whatever, and they're looking for some nice sounding melodic part or a solo drum break. For example, something like this. And then they sample it into their MPC or any other sampler, or actually use a computer. Then on top of that they build their own tracks, of course changing the pitch, rearranging the melody, adding some other sounds, you know the rest of the stuff. But if producers could work both with 12-inch records and 7-inch records, why do I say that these singles became the goldmine for hip-hop samples? That's a very interesting question. Let me start with the highlights. One of the most famous drum break samples that was used in thousands of tracks, the sample that created genres, is actually Amen Break, that came from a 7-inch single, the Winstons' Amen Brother. Maybe the previous example is not a staple in hip-hop, well, due to the very fast BPM, and it's more suitable for jungle and breakbeat and drum and bass. Well, the next example is an absolute foundation of hip-hop, and it was also found on a 7-inch record. I'm talking about funky drummer James Brown.
1, 2, 3, 4, get it!
The next example of a drum break, it's a quiet revolution in hip-hop tracks, because these drums, they were literally used as a drum break and as separate one-shots in, I guess, 8 out of 10 tracks. I'm talking about Melvin Bliss' Synthetic Substitution. The first track was Reward, but actually the second track, the B-side, became popular because of the drum break. Synthetic Substitution is just awesome. Shall I give you another legendary example? Pfft, easily, the Honey Drippers Impeach the President.
Ladies and gentlemen.
And again, this wonderful drum break was found on a small 7-inch record. Okay, enough with the drum breaks, however, I still can continue this list. Let's talk about the legendary melodic samples. And personally for me, I can't imagine where hip-hop would be today if RZA didn't find an awesome sounding sample, again on a 7-inch record by the Charmels, As Long As I've Got You. Okay, but maybe you're into the West Coast hip-hop. I've got something for you. Charles Wright, Express Yourself.
Express yourself.
But why? Why the 7-inch records? Is it some weird statistics? Well, actually no, there is a simple explanation to this, why the 7-inch records were such an impact. If you, for example, take a look at the examples that I gave you, most of them, I mean the bands, the musicians, they unfortunately weren't successful. Back in the days it was all about the labels, the radio, that kind of statistics, and most of the musicians, they started with singles, with only 2 tracks. Well, obviously it's easier and cheaper to record 2 tracks to see if the band is successful with radio plays, with concerts, and then if yes, they continued and recorded a full LP album. For example, with Melvin Bliss and Roy C., unfortunately, those talented musicians were not commercially successful back in the days. That's why their talented tracks, their absolutely stunning music was, so to say, buried in those 7-inch records. And then those singles were long forgotten. And maybe if not hip-hop, we wouldn't know about them again. Because in the late 80s and early 90s, when American producers found the golden nuggets hidden in those forgotten 7-inch records, they rushed to all stores and bought crates of single vinyl records. And just imagine how many talented musicians created very nice tracks, but unfortunately, due to the time limitations, they weren't able to produce full albums and continue with their discography. Can we say thank you, hip-hop, for reviving the legacy of those talented musicians? And looking back at the music history today, 7-inch vinyl singles might seem completely natural, but in reality, they weren't supposed to exist at one point.
Why the 7-inch size and the 45 speed? Just to be different?
No, sir. The new size and the new speed came out of many problems and difficulties. Your difficulties with past records and record changes, and your problems of record storage in homes that tend ever to grow smaller and smaller.
In the late 40s and the early 50s, there was a real format war between two industry giants. Columbia Records focused on the 12-inch long plays, big records that could hold around 20 minutes of music per side. And the company RCA Victor took a different path and released 7-inch records at 45 RPM. RCA positioned themselves as the format of the future, smaller, cheaper, more convenient. And Columbia considered that their format was more serious and that they would win. But why RCA bet on 7-inch singles? RCA realized that there was a huge audience that Columbia almost ignored: teenagers and youth. In post-war America, when the economy was growing, teenagers got their first money and a new cultural demand emerged. They wanted individual hits, not expensive albums. RCA came up with a brilliant marketing move: personal players for 7-inch singles. Look at those players. These small portable devices were advertised as music for your room. They were affordable, simple to use, and people could insert even multiple records. 45 RPM, the music revolution you can hold in your hand. This phrase was in the RCA marketing campaigns, and literally they showed it everywhere in magazines that the music is very convenient to hold like this, in your hands, not like a big chunky 12-inch record. Moreover, I honestly didn't know about the fact, but there is some bulging in the middle of a vinyl record player. It was made deliberately because you could stack those singles together on top of each other, and they wouldn't touch the sides where the music is. Very genius move, RCA, very genius. And it's very interesting how history repeats itself, because the thing with RCA singles and teenagers is something similar to Spotify and Apple Music and streaming nowadays, because what helped Spotify and Apple Music to boom? This was your own playlist back in the days, the singles. But the real explosion in popularity came when 7-inch singles were loaded into jukeboxes. In the 1950s America, jukeboxes were in every bar, diner, gas station, and even barbershops. Each jukebox could hold from 50 to 100 singles, and customers could pick a song for 5 or 10 cents. And also this fact made 7-inch records an economic engine for the industry. And of course, jukeboxes helped young Elvis Presley become a superstar back in the days. The first single to sweep America was That's Alright in 1954. People played it over and over again, lining up to drop a coin and hear this wild new sound. And then the company RCA realized the future was with the youth. Rock and roll. Pay attention at how the jukeboxes work and at their mechanism. This is the answer why the 7-inch records had a giant hole in the middle. It was easier for the jukeboxes to operate this way when the vinyl record was dropped onto the mechanism. In the 1950s and 60s, tens of millions of singles were sold every year in the US. For example, in 1958, over 50 million 7-inch records were sold in the USA. And it's very important to understand that all this shiny madness existed exclusively in the United States of America. In Europe, the market was much smaller. And in the USSR part of the world, nothing of that kind existed. Those jukeboxes in the restaurants, in fast food restaurants, it wasn't a luxury because it just didn't exist. And people back in the days, they didn't know that they don't have something because they didn't know what other people had, like jukeboxes and those vertical personal players for 7-inch records. Even nowadays, when I read about it, when I watch videos about it, I'm fascinated by the fact that it already existed back in the days. It's crazy. Just buying the regular LP albums was already a luxury for a lot of people. And the music was usually not Elvis Presley, not something else, not James Brown, of course, but the local stage, the local music, which is great, but it was only local music. And of course, not millions of copies were sold, probably hundred thousands of copies. And eventually the format war ended in a draw. Everybody benefited from it. LP records from Columbia won the album category. It became the standard for long recordings and serious music. RCA's 7-inch singles won the pop hit and the youth segment. And together they defined the music industry for the decades ahead. And when I read and learn everything about it, I no longer hold a vinyl record in my hand. It's already a piece of giant history. And now let's turn this record from 1978 into a track today in 2025. There is a nice sample, listen. Very nice. So I start my project with this fantastic sample that I found on this 7-inch record. And of course, as usual, I always slice my samples, and I will never get tired of explaining why. Because first of all, you fit the sample much better into the BPM, into the groove with drums. Because if you don't slice your samples, everything is going to be misaligned unless you are aiming at that result. And of course, you can later rearrange your patterns. For example, it starts like this, and then different chops. And now the most frequently asked question by my students or just people on the internet: how do I find the key of the sample? How do I find the notes of the sample? And the question that always comes next is: how do I properly write the bass melody for my sample? That's quite easy. I have the answer. Right now we're going to listen to the sample and we're going to be looking at the tuner. So you're doing it like this. Tuner, instead of input 1 and 2, you select resample left plus right. You hit play, E, then it's D, yes, it's D, it's C, and I think we're going just one step. Yes, it's B. Okay, so for me it's quite clear. I'm going to use the built-in Mini D synthesizer, which is another instance of Mini Moog and this Moog line of synthesizers. I'm going to use the pad perform, of course, E minor, which is set not to be misaligned. And then it's correct. Yes. Second is correct. Let's try. Third is correct. And I think and fourth is also correct. And then back to 1. And this is how you learn the notes, the key of your sample. And now another significant part of hip-hop tracks is the drums or the drum breaks, because this is extremely important. It can build your track or destroy your track. You can have an awesome melodic sample, but if the drums don't fit, your track you don't have a track. And for that project, I'm going to use, you guessed it right, my sample pack that I recorded. It's volume 1, volume 2 is coming soon. And from this sample pack, I have a drum break. That is a drum break. However, I chopped it already, and I chopped it because it's a sample pack and all the chops are already here. The kick, the snare, the head, and so on and so forth. However, I have a trick in this drum break. Let me show you. So I can play it like this. And it sounds alright. However, you might think that something is missing. I guess I know why. Because I think for that project, for that melodic sample, hi-hats are better at 16th. I'm going to use a simple trick. So I go to my main hat and I'm going to use a simultaneous play to pad 10. And listen, there is a delay, the latency. Why? Because I go to page 3. This is the offset. So you can hear that I press the pad and the sound comes later. That's why we have it's a swing without actually applying the swing. And make sure that your secondary hi-hat is much quieter than your main hat. You obviously hear it's loud, it's quiet. If you want to adjust the parameters of the volume, you can do it in here, but it's already much quieter. The track mix window, and believe it or not, everything is extremely simple. I think this is the key to success, keeping it simple with your editing. Because quite often we have this conversation with my students where they think that, okay, maybe later at the mixing stage, I'm going to give all the tracks to the mixing engineer and he's going to use some magic plugins, magic expensive plugins, and my track is finally going to sound much, much better. And the answer is no. The volume is the main tool that you have, so pen and volume. Your hats should be quieter than your snare and kick, for example. Your secondary snare should blend in with your main snare, and so on and so forth. Your melodic sample shouldn't be bleeding through the track. This is called gain staging. This is very important, even before applying any plugins. And speaking of plugins, with a melodic sample, it's all simple. I just boosted the low frequencies because in some other parts I have bass, for example in here. Yes, and I just increased the bass range. Soft Clipper, this is my favorite go-to plugin. This is the secret weapon because it just collects the sound. And compressor, again, this compressor just levels the loudness of the entire sample because I have different loud parts, quiet parts. If you look at the reduction bar, the golden bar, this is the main part. Okay, I have some reduction and then, yeah, about some are quieter, some are affected more, but of course because they are not even, and after a compressor it becomes more flat, but in a good way. It fits the track better. With the drums it's even simpler. I have one instance of Soft Clipper and just listen to how it gathers all the sound in front of you. Before, it's so aggressive now. So without the plugin, the sound disappears. And then one of my other favorite plugins is Enhancer. Listen to what it does. Just a slight touch of boost in the high range and some nice harmonics. So again, it makes the drum break a little more beautiful, but a little more aggressive as well. It cuts through the mix. And that's it. It's all that simple. And so altogether, the track sounds like this. And if you want to learn how to use MPC or SP404 professionally, I have special educational courses just for you. And it's not a typical masterclass or me showing off my skills, no, it's a step-by-step complete educational program where we start with zero and end up having a full, complete track. The link is in the description. And of course, this is not everything about sampling and hip-hop. You can watch these videos right here, they are quite informative. See you later, bye.